today, what I'd like to do is take you through a little bit of my own background. In the process, however, I want to really look at what great leaders do. I'm going to use some of my own personal heroes and make some observations about them first, so we can kind of lay the groundwork for what I happen to think are great leaders do, and the kind that I admire. And then the question is really, how do you become one? And is it something you can learn? And if you can learn it, what is the learning curve? And that's where I'm going to dive into a little bit of my own background and at least tell you some stories and a few anecdotes about how I learned at least what great leaders did from a business-to-business standpoint. At the end of this, I'll hopefully draw some relevant conclusions. We'll invite questions. I also have some suggested reading for those of you who are interested in learning more about this topic. Along the way, please jot down questions and send them to Adler, and he'll ask them at the end of this. So in doing my research on this, I came across this wonderful quote, and somebody had posted it on LinkedIn, I think, last week. I hadn't seen it before, but it struck home because the topic of leadership is a very interesting one. Everyone talks about leadership. We all want to be leaders, or at least we all think we want to be leaders. Schools talk about learning to be leaders. I would make the case that most colleges and universities talk about it, but more often they talk about how you do the work and learn to do the project and use the tools that help us become whatever we want to become, whether it's in finance or marketing or technology, whatever it is. The leadership idea is a more intangible one. And in my experience, there's really only one school I know of that focuses on leadership totally, and that would be West Point. Other organizations, talk about it, but I think you sort of have to learn by doing or learn by example. And too often, leadership is thought of as the ability to tell other people what to do. So hopefully we'll dispel some of that as we go along here. But let's start by talking about what we mean by great leaders. And when I talk about leaders, I mean this kind and not that kind. Both are worthy of study. Both have been leaders in their own way, but I'd like us to be thinking about the kind that we would like to emulate going forward. So as we do this, I'm hoping that you'll be thinking about favorite leaders that you might have, and they don't have to be heads of state. They can be any number of groups, anybody who's actually in a position of leadership in an organization or sometimes in a family. But I'm going to talk through 5 of mine. You should recognize most, but if not all of them. And I want to talk through them in a way that we really kind of isolate what was it that made them great leaders. The first, of course, is one of my all-time heroes and somebody that we all know. The first principle, the first observation I would make about Abraham Lincoln is, and I don't think there's any question about this, he was a man known for his very strong principles. He had very clear vision and unquestionable resolve about accomplishing what he wanted to accomplish. It's often thought that his core vision for upon taking the presidency was to end slavery. And in fact, that wasn't it. His principal vision was to hold the Union together. And he was determined to do that, whatever it took. And that's where he started. And we'll come back to in a minute how he changed that vision over time, which is an important aspect of leadership, I believe. But going into this job, he was underestimated by everyone, and for pretty good reason. He'd never done anything like it. He'd never even run a city council. The most he had ever run, he was a congressman, but before that he ran his own small law firm in Springfield, Illinois, and had really not been a manager to speak of for anything else. So when he came into this job, he was pretty much underestimated by everybody. He sort of got there by default if you study how the electoral process worked back then under those extraordinary circumstances. But he was an exceptional writer, as we know, and communicator, and his principles had come through. And so there were a number of people that somehow thought that he was their guy. And he learned on the job very quickly, in fact. And one of the key attributes that I think he had was that he was willing to change and adapt to new realities. And he got there by listening to opposing views. He took responsibility for his own decisions in the end, but he did hear what other people had to say. And one of the views that he came to change was his position on slavery. He always hated it, but he came to believe in the end that that was what the Civil War was about, and he helped make the rest of the country believe that as well. Known to be a compassionate human character, and also for his legendary and very self-effacing way. Moving forward a number of decades, another classic leader, the iconic British bulldog, if you will, Winston Churchill, also a determined, unwavering, and fearless leader, prolific writer, one of the most prolific authors of the 20th century, won a Nobel Prize, in fact, for doing that. We've all heard recordings of his inspiring voice, a powerful communicator, a strategic visionary. He not only understood what it took to, from a political aspect, but he understood the global perspective from a military aspect and from a geopolitical perspective, because he had very keen intellect. He really did understand the big picture. The bold innovator. He supported the development of the Enigma machine to break the code of the Nazis and things like radar. But he also was a communications pioneer. He used radio very effectively. And through his voice and his message, he reached well beyond the British Isles to the United States and all of the free world, and became the voice of the free world. He was undaunted by failure. He had actually failed significantly after World War I. He had become, he was, I believe, Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I. And then he was put out literally in the cold during the 30s when he was the lone voice warning about Hitler. And no one wanted to hear from him. He was humiliated in many ways, but he didn't let it get in his way. He continued to say what he thought was right. And then at the end of his tenure in World War II, after having helped the world defeat the fascist scourge, his own people voted him out of office. And instead of stamping his feet or pouting, he heard their voice, he believed in democracy, and he left with grace. He was elected several years later again, which is great, but he understood that he was a servant of his people, not the other way around. And of course, his penetrating wit is very well known. Another great prime minister, the first female prime minister for the UK, Maggie Thatcher, also had a very clear vision and mission. Her mission was to end the socialist state as she perceived it as the United Kingdom. Also an excellent orator, a great debater, and if you've ever watched any of the any parliamentary debates, you know that they get pretty vicious. Fearless in her convictions, a bold thinker, very collaborative partner. She very soon partnered well with Ronald Reagan, who was president at the time, and was the first to really recognize that Mikhail Gorbachev was someone that they could work with. She famously said, he's someone we can do business with, in reporting into Ronald Reagan on her first meeting with him, and was therefore instrumental in starting to end the Cold War. Decisive and resolute, even if it meant she was unpopular, and she was very unpopular at the time, certainly amongst the labor unions. Had a wonderful acerbic humor as well. A great communicator. If you notice a certain conservative bent to my politics, that's probably true. But at the same time, I do think most people now recognize that Reagan, who was also underestimated throughout his life, was one of the more, I'd say, accomplished presidents in certain recent history. He, too, had a clear and wavering vision. He felt the government was too big and fought hard against the Democrats on that proposition. But he had an even bigger vision, which was he hated nuclear weapons. And he was determined during his lifetime to eliminate them. He didn't, in the end, succeed fully, but he got pretty close. And he made a huge difference. He also understood that nothing is accomplished without some compromise. You can't do this on your own. And there are famous stories of him and former Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, a wonderful Democrat from Boston, who would, and they'd go at each other viciously during the day, fighting over legislation and principles, because they were sort of polar opposites in many ways. But then they'd go out and they'd have a drink together, like two old Pauls and work out a solution, something that one might argue has been missing in recent years. They understood both, that ideology is one thing, but in the end, to get something done, you have to compromise. And he was a bold thinker, and he was underestimated for that because people kind of thought he was a second-rate actor and sort of a political hack manipulated by his advisors. If you read more about him, you'll know that that really wasn't the case. He brought in exceptional advisors, and he listened to them, but he had his own point of view, and he was pretty strong about it. And through his own wit and charm, he persuaded his enemies to really see, to actually come along. They didn't always have to agree with him, but at least they agreed that he had a point of view that was worth listening to. And he was exceptional at explaining his point of view to the American public and the world. One of the great phrases was his speech in Berlin, where he simply said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And within months, it happened. This gentleman you may not know, but he is a personal hero of mine and someone I was quite privileged to work with in my years working first at Young & Rubicam and then later at Landor, which was a division of Young & Rubicam. And if you are interested in marketing communications as a career, you should know him. He was the creator and then chairman of Young & Rubicam Group that now exists, part of WPP Group. But he himself was a bold industry innovator. He grew up as an ad guy, but he was the guy who conceived what we now call the integrated marketing communication services model. And by that I mean back in the 70s, he understood that advertising alone wasn't the solution to a total client service package in marketing communication. And so he brought in Burson Marsteller, the world's leading PR firms, at Wunderman, one of the leading direct marketing firms. Eventually that included Landor and a number of other digital and other firms that became best-of-class partners under one roof. It's now an accepted practice with all of the big marketing communications conglomerates, but he was one of the first. Not only that, he was ambassador to Canada under Push 1, and an articulate, distinctive speaker. He had a very noticeable, very husky voice that people always like to imitate, and endeared him to us all. He was a fierce and feared competitor in the business, but always gracious and self-effacing. You never saw him without a bow tie and a beautifully manicured blazer or suit, and if you were anywhere in his presence, he would introduce himself. He would always talk to you. Didn't matter what you were doing or what level you were, he was always a gentleman. And he knew that hiring the best talent and empowering them to succeed was how he was going to succeed. Perhaps the most resonant thing about him, or one of the things I noticed first and have always tried to emulate, whenever you talk to Ed Ney about all the different things that he'd accomplished, whether it was helping the trade agreements between Canada and the U.S. as an ambassador, or building the Young Rubicam Group, where he was particularly proud of the United Negro College Fund branding work that they, marketing work that they had done. It was always we and never I. We did this, and then we did that. And I think that is an important and telling distinction for somebody like him. So what character traits did they all share? Each saw the larger objective. Whatever their individual challenges or problems that they had to overcome, they saw the big picture. They were each persuasive communicators. They articulated big, complex ideas in terms that the everyday citizen could understand, and made people believe in those ideals and be inspired by them. They weren't afraid to try and fail, and every one of these people failed. Several of them failed big time and then came back. They built effective and loyal teams. In many cases, teams that didn't really like each other or were very different culturally and politically. But they knew that if they followed his lead or their or her lead, they could achieve great things. And each of these leaders was able to pull these teams together to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish. And each connected personally with their constituents. There was, whether it was through radio or through direct contact, they were able to communicate a genuine humanity, and often through engaging wit. In short, they inspired trust, confidence, and tremendous achievement in those they led. So that's all well and good for saving the free world. But for the rest of us, the question is, well, what can we learn from this? And is it really teachable? Do we even want to be leaders? Not everybody does. Not everybody needs to be a leader. Got to be a few followers. And there are many people who want to focus in on their particular skill or passion, and they're very happy to continue to do that. So can these ideas help us to be better managers, better partners, or maybe just better citizens? Well, I'd like to think so, and I'm going to make my case now. So here are some possible things that you may find useful. They're lessons from over the past 40 years in marketing communications. I started out in advertising. I've worked in PR. I have my own business. I'm back having my own business, and of course I spent 20 years in the branding business. So across all that time, I've observed a lot, and I will share some stories with you. Some of them are little parables that I've created for myself that my kids are very tired of hearing, as are many of my colleagues, but I'm going to pain you with them anyway. And I'm going to start and do this through a series of different phases, if you will. And they're basically four. First is going to be about starting out. And I'm going to assume that a number of you in the audience are students and that you're thinking about careers and how you get started in a career and how you build your reputation and go forward and maybe one day become a leader. So this is for you. And the first lesson in life, frankly, I believe, is to listen and observe. It's very hard to learn things with your mouth open talking. So I look for young people when they come into the business who are alert, who are keen to learn, and who have very open ears. The next thing you have to do is learn to do your job well. And I don't care if it's making the copies or the coffee or being the assistant to the assistant. Learn the job and develop a reputation as someone who does a good job. But at the same time, if you want to be upwardly mobile, you need to be curious about what others are doing and why they're doing. And so start to get to know others and start to find out about other jobs in the company that you may be working or the organization you're working in. Along the way, you have to earn the trust of those with whom you work. And this is my first rule. And this is one I learned early on. And it's pretty simple. If you actually do what you say you're going to do, that puts you in a very rare group, because most people talk the talk but don't deliver. So I personally made it a mission of my own to try to keep my promises. If I said I was going to deliver something at such and such a date or time, I would virtually kill myself to get it done. If you do that, you will be in the 98th percentile, I believe. You need to be open to other points of view and learn from them. This is especially true early on, where you get a lot of critique as a young worker, whatever field you're in. The managers will come along and give you direction. You'll also get opinions from people that you may not agree with at all. And out of that experience, I developed what I call the 10% rule, which is no matter how much you may disagree with what somebody's telling you or their point of view on something, you should give them 10%, because they probably wouldn't have brought it up if there wasn't something to it. And this is really true in personal critique. And I've been critiqued many times by people, and I said, they don't know what they're talking about. But they wouldn't have brought it up if there wasn't some truth in there somewhere, and I can learn from that, and I will try to learn from that. So that's my 10% rule. Always seek new responsibilities. This is called raising your hand. Now, raising your hand to get new responsibilities if you haven't finished the job you were assigned to do is not such a good idea. You want to do a good job at what you were tasked with, but at the same time, you want to be seen as someone who's very willing to step up. And if a manager comes to you and asks if you can help, the answer should almost always be yes. It may be followed by, I have 2 other responsibilities here. Help me with my priorities. Which would you like me to do first, or do you want to talk to my direct report about these other 2 things so that we're all on the same page about what I'm going to do next? But take the responsibility if you can. It will help you along the way. Be a good teammate. And here I have outlined the rule of the trench. A very good friend of mine who worked with me on the Jello business back in the early 80s at Y&R. He's an Australian, and he used to say, mate, when you're going up over the trench, you don't want to be looking around to see who's with you, which I always love, because when you're going in to solve a problem and you have a team, you want to make sure that everybody's on the same page with you, that they're all behind you and you're behind them. And that was an early learning in terms of putting partners together. And we'll talk a little bit more about building a posse later on. But you want to be a good teammate first and foremost. And that means, again, delivering on your promises. If you see something that needs fixing, by all means, raise your hand, recommend a solution. But don't recommend it to be solved by somebody else, which is what most people do. If you see a problem, say, here's what I see, and here's what I'd like to do about it, or here's what I'd like to get some people to help me do something about. In other words, offer to do the work yourself, and that way it'll do two things. One, it'll get done, and you will get a reputation for somebody who gets something done. Also, mentors, very important. I have a number of them. I still do. And these are people you respect and want to be like in some ways. But to do that, you need to observe what they do. What made them successful? How did they manage their teams? How do they work with their clients? How do they manage upwards? It's very important not only to manage the people around you, but to manage your boss. So there are good ways and bad ways to do that effectively. So that's sort of the beginning phase of learning how to be a leader. I'm a big Harry Truman fan, and he has this wonderful quote, "It's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit." My teams have often heard me say that. I believe it wholeheartedly. It's in the process of managing others. And there are actually there have always been two ways, I believe, to manage, but it's more prevalent today for a number of reasons, and I'll talk about those. Then there's the direct report, those who report directly to you. There are some basic rules of how to do that, and usually at this stage of the game, let's say you're in your late 20s, early 30s, you're becoming a young manager. And often the first time you get to manage somebody, they're an intern or they're a newbie or someone who's come into the fold, or there's a new opportunity has come along and suddenly you're the person on the point. So what are some basic rules of management? Because that's the beginning of leadership. First and foremost, clear direction with specific deliverables and timing. If you don't understand the assignment yourself, you can't really expect others to get it by osmosis. You have to be able to give them good direction. That's where writing skills come into play for starters, and speaking skills, of course. Positive reinforcement along the way. I learned that a long time ago in the advertising business. If you're going to critique copy, it's always really easy to say, I don't like that, or that part really I hate. Much better to say, here's what's great about what you've done so far. Here's what I would like to see maybe a little different, and here's why. But always start with positive reinforcement. Course correction where and when necessary. No plan goes as planned. And as you are managing others, you want to make sure that they check in with you, that you're on top of what they're doing without smothering them, and that you're listening to what they have to say. Because guess what? They may come back with an idea you didn't think of. In fact, you hope they do, because that means they're an up-and-comer and somebody you want to have on your team. But you got to know, first you got to recognize good ones when they happen, and you want to be open to it and not just come back and say, well, no, that's not the way we do it, unless there's a very good reason for not doing it that way. Then there's the indirect approach, and this is more and more prevalent in our digitized virtual world. In my case, when I was Chief Marketing Officer at Landor, I had, I think, a half a dozen or more direct reports, some in New York, some in San Francisco, but then there was a whole team of people around the world we worked with, some 30 or 40 people in the marketing and business development groups in our 24 different offices. And these people didn't report to me or to the Marcom team directly. They reported to their own managing directors. But at the same time, we all knew that if we didn't move the ship in a consistent direction and use messaging in a consistent way, that we would diffuse what the value of our message was. And so all of these people managed to really work together wonderfully with my team. I loved the process. It was essentially the same rules that apply to direct reports, but there's an increased responsibility for communication. And we made a point of always being on, every 2 weeks, being on a direct phone call with the different leaders, marketing leaders from around the world on our firm. And another little lesson I learned was to make sure I kept their managers informed about what they were doing so they didn't look like some rogue project somewhere. And also to make sure that we shared praise openly for whenever they did good work helping us. And lastly, sounds silly, but don't forget please and thank you. No one has to do anything for you, and they want to know that you cared about it and that you paid attention to it. So what's the goal of this? Well, ultimately, as you keep going, you want to be the go-to person, right? You want to be known as the person who takes on the toughest jobs and gets them through successfully. And to do that, you're going to need help. And that's where the posse comes in. Your trusted fellow professionals, the people that will always come through for you or with you, and importantly, that you will always come through for as well. You have to have each other's back. And over the years, I started to develop a group of people in the different places that I worked who I knew I could count on. Many of them I'm working with again to this day, or have come in and out of my own professional life. But these are people that you can always count on, and they're the ones you want to work with. And one way to assure that they will work with you in this way is that you make sure they get appropriate credit, and that could be financial as well as verbal, and that they get visibility for what they do so that it's recognized that they are contributing to the whole. I also learned along the way that you take every opportunity you can to write and present. Leadership, as we've seen from the examples I showed earlier, demands exceptional communication skills. That's the only way you can influence large groups of people. And if it isn't your strong suit, and for many people it isn't, writing happened to be my background. I was a creative writing major at the University of Miami, but writing memos wasn't exactly what they were training me to do, so you have to learn how to write clear communication that direct people to do things. For many people, presenting doesn't come naturally. In fact, Winston Churchill had a serious stammer that he had to overcome to become one of the greatest orators in history. So if it doesn't come naturally, work on it, get training. Practice it. There are courses for business writing. There are plenty of courses for presentation skills training, and I've taken several of them because I just want to get better at it. It just is a key part of whatever I think anyone does. And I don't care if you're a software engineer or a broker or whatever it is. You have to sell things. You have to sell ideas sooner or later. And the people who are best at explaining their ideas in clear terms and being compelling about it are the ones that move forward. And then last on this schedule is look for new ways to add value. And by that I mean, it's again back to raising your hand. Is there something else that you see in the organization that could be used some fixing? Is there something you can bring to your clients? The most successful client managers I've ever worked with are the ones who would say, I've got an idea for you. Here's how we could help you make more money. Let's take you through it. There's not a client in the world that isn't going to sit still for that and hear what you had to say. They may not buy it, but they will be respectful of the fact you brought it to them. And there are other ways you can do it even within your own community if you want to be a volunteer, which is a great thing to do. Well, no presentation will be complete without a quote from one of the world's great philosophers of the 20th century, and of course that's Rocky Balboa. This is a quote I use all the time, and I love it. It's, I think, from one of his last movies. But life's not about how hard you hit. It's about how you take the hits that you get and get back up. Because guess what? No matter how well it's going for you and how well you follow the rules of being a good manager and a potential leader and all these things, something's going to go wrong. Man plans, God laughs. So what do you do about that? Well, as we've seen, every one of the leaders that we've talked about all had their own setbacks. And I've had plenty myself. But if you look at all failures as opportunities, which I believe is the exact quote that Winston Churchill, who featured earlier, said, and if you understand that no one is really interested in why you failed, unless it's to learn together so you don't make the same mistake again, then there's only one outcome, and that's going forward. And as I said, I failed many times. I've been fired 3 times in my life. Each time ended up being the best thing that ever happened to me in retrospect. Wasn't so great at the time. I don't recommend going out and getting fired regularly, but it's a learning experience, and it forces you to do this, which is reinvent yourself. That means applying the lessons of failure, learning from the mistakes, acknowledging that no matter, again, the 10% rule, even if you think that it was totally unjustified, there had to be something in there that you could have done differently or better to maybe have changed the situation. So learn from it. And then deal with the new reality. It's not going to be the same as it was when you went into the last job. Life has changed. Life changes constantly, as we all know. So start rebuilding your personal brand. What are your strengths? What are the things that you're best at? Where have you built your reputation? Build from that. Set new goals for yourself. Now that you're back into either a new job or on your own or whatever you're doing, what is it you want to accomplish? You've now had the benefit of some years of experience in the world and in business. You should be able to figure out where you want to go next. And then hold yourself accountable. It's great to set goals, but if you don't really force yourself to achieve them, they're kind of useless. You won't know this fellow. This is my father-in-law, a much-loved man. And he had a wonderful saying that used to hit us with every now and then. You'll make money, you'll lose money, and you'll make money again. But if you lose your reputation, you will never get it back. And he's right. This is about the high ground. This is now you've gone through the learning process at the early stage. You've become a middle manager. You've overcome obstacles that have gotten in your way. And now you're in a senior position somewhere. Now it's about leading from strength and taking the long-term view. Another one of my old homilies is based on years that I spent sailing. I don't know if you've been in motorboats or sailboats, but if you get in a motorboat and you want to go to a buoy or a port somewhere, you basically point at it and hit the throttle and off you go. If you're in a sailboat, it doesn't quite work that way. You're quite susceptible to winds and tides, and, currents, and weather in general. So you have to always keep in mind where you want to go, but you have to be prepared to tack left and right, take some slight detours to get to where you ultimately want to go. But a great manager and a great leader never loses sight of the goal. And so, like a great sailor, you need to have your eye on the long-term goal. What is your ambition? Where do you want to be? Where do you want your organization to be? Where do you want your group to be or your team? Whatever it is that you are leading, think about the big picture. Also, now you are there to look for and embrace problems, hopefully before they happen. It's part of what leadership does. It's to anticipate what's coming next and where things could go off and how you can brace for that. Or when problems hit, how do you deal with them? But you can't deal with them as a senior leader all by yourself. Again, you need teams, and you need others to help you solve them. And one of the great transition risks for up-and-coming managers as they move into senior positions is what I call the sin of micromanagement. You can't let go of the wheel, but at the same time, you can't drive it for everybody else. Said another way, you have to get your hands dirty on occasion, but you don't want to get stuck in the mud. Too many young managers or up-and-coming managers can't let go of the project. They have people with them who are very talented and are eager to do it, but they smother them with quote-unquote help. And that's not how other people grow. It's not how you teach. And that's not how you build a team, because all that does is keep you in the same pond that you always were in. And since time gets more and more precious, the older you get and the more responsibilities you get, you have to really, at this point, start to learn to use your time very productively and set your own priorities for where can I help and where do I need other people to help me. And speaking of responsibility, you have to take it. As we all know, the old phrase, success has many authors, failure only one. But as a responsible leader, the buck does stop with you, to quote Harry Truman. And I have a favorite story of General Eisenhower, who very famously was standing on the tarmac of the Southern England one of the airfields in Southern England as the first wave of paratroopers went over to France to begin D-Day, the Great Invasion, the largest invasion in the history of the world to this day. And it had been planned to a fare thee well for years, and every last obstacle and problem and opportunity had been thought through multiple ways. but it was a very risky move. And he knew there was a high possibility, almost a probability, that it would fail. So in his pocket, he had this note, and I'm going to read it to you. This was the note he was planning to go public with if the attack failed. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. That's a leader. So, as we start to wrap up here, I've used this quote many, many times. I use it usually in referring to my work with Ed Ney, who would invite you into his office when you're working on a project, and you go in terrified because he was such an important guy at Young and Rubicon, and you sort of sit there trembling, and he'd ask you some very pointed questions about whatever the project was, and he'd listen intently and ask you some more questions, and then in the end, if you told him honestly what you believed, and if he believed that you knew the path you were on and what you were going to do, you would say, okay, go do it. And you'd walk out of that meeting feeling like $1 million. So this is what I used to say about him. A big man can make you feel small, but a great man will make you feel 10 feet tall. And I went to search on Google the other day to see who actually said that, and my name came up in some articles. So I'm taking credit. If you know someone who actually did say it before me, please let me know. So what have we learned? Well, leadership is learned, I believe, and of course earned. Great leaders listen well and communicate clearly. They think big and long term. They build loyal, effective teams through inspiration and incentive. They stay the course and shake off failure. And they take their goals and tasks very seriously, but not themselves. Leadership is learned and earned. Go be one, because we need you. And as you do that, here's some literature that I would suggest. I'm not a big business book guy. I kind of find them kind of boring. So it's much easier for me to go read other people's treatises about how they did what they did. One of the first books I read that I thought and I started to recommend to people as one of the greatest books on management I ever read was Gore Vidal's Lincoln, written back in the 70s. And it's what would be called faction, historical fiction, actually a precursor to what Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, The Team of Rivals, later was, which is about Lincoln and his cabinet during the war, a portion of which later became the movie Lincoln that was so popular a year or two ago. This is a great book about how Lincoln took his political enemies, all of them, each one of them thought he was a buffoon and wanted to be president instead of him, and he put them all in his cabinet because for two very smart reasons. First was better to watch them as opposed to having them behind his back somewhere. And secondly, because he knew they all had tremendous skill sets. And he wanted to make sure that he took advantage of those, that he put those to good work, and he got them to work as a team. Seven Pillars of Wisdom is by the great Lawrence of Arabia, in many ways the inventor of guerrilla warfare. And he took disparate, talk about cultural differences and different agendas, and pulling together, if you've seen Lawrence of Arabia, the movie, it kind of captures it, but the real truth is even much more fascinating. Or you may want to read a recent book called Hero by Michael Porter, which is a great biography of personal memoirs of U.S. Grant. He was known as, well, he was a failure for most of his life until his calling as the winning general of the Civil War. But he was an exceptional writer, very crisp, very clear. He was known, one of the reasons for his success as a general was that his orders were hard to mistake. The recent book I read is Reagan at Reykjavik, which is about the famous summit meeting between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in Iceland in the 80s, which became the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And it's a fascinating study of both Reagan and Gorbachev and their management styles and how they both came, nearly failed at the conference, but in the end, this became the beginning of the major disarmament agreements and ultimately the demise of the Soviet Union. Of course, anything by or about Winston Churchill is fabulous, and I happen to think David McCall is a wonderful biographer of great leaders, Truman and Teddy Roosevelt and others. And that is that. I welcome questions.
Wow, Hayes, thank you so much. That was incredible. All right. For those of you who are listening and would like to submit a question, on your screen is a little pop-up box, and it should be in your top right-hand corner. There's a little place called Chat, and where you can write your questions and submit, and I'll be delighted to read them. And starting off, we have a couple of questions for you, Hayes. First question: do you think of yourself as a leader when you first started in business?
Well, as I often said to students I've spoken with who always ask me, well, what was your plan going forward? And the fact of the truth is, I really didn't have a plan. I saw advertising with my creative writing background from Miami. I saw advertising as a likely place to go, and I thought maybe I'd be a copywriter. So I wasn't really thinking in terms of leadership back then. But once I got into the ad agency in Minneapolis that I worked at, I started to notice who was calling the shots, and there was a guy who ran the firm called Stan Blunt, who I happen to get to know pretty well. And I just thought he was a class act, and I loved how he managed the place. I loved how he was directing traffic, so to speak, at the company, and how he worked with clients. And I thought, I could do that, or I sure would like to try. So ultimately, after the first few years of working in that situation and observing people like Stan, I came to decide, let me go for it. I would like to go for it. It's one of the reasons ultimately I ended up in New York.
Great. Thank you so much. Here's another question we can start it with. Who do you consider to be an exceptional leader today?
That's a tougher question. And it's always, interesting. If you think back to all of the great examples that I gave you at the time, all those leaders, if you'd ask people during their lifetimes if they were great leaders, you would get differing opinion, because to be a great leader is pretty controversial. Not everybody agrees, right? Usually it's history that sort of determines. But I would say there are two people now that I am watching with great interest in this regard. One is Pope Francis, and I'm not a Catholic. I'm not a particularly religious person, but I think he is someone who is out to make a difference, and I think he's following a lot of the precepts of leadership that we've been talking about. He clearly has listened to people. He has the human touch by all means, but he's also quite an eloquent speaker, and he is now more and more putting forth his much more liberal agenda. In fact, there was a story in the Times today about how the American bishops all got together, and they're nervous. They're not quite sure where he's going with all this, and there are a number of very conservative bishops and religious leaders who are worried about it. But you don't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. So I think he's definitely someone to watch, and has, he could make a real difference for the world, I believe. Another one who I'm fascinated by, and this will be a bit polarizing, but I think Hillary Clinton is somebody to watch. I think if she does make it into the presidency, she has the potential to be a great leader. She's come up through the ranks. She's learned the process. She knows how to cut deals because she was in Congress for so long, which is something, unfortunately, our current leader, who has many great attributes and who I am not ashamed to say I voted for at least once, I think she has some skill sets of leadership and strength that will bear watching.
Great. And here's another question. Do you have to be the CEO to be a leader?
No, absolutely not. I never became a CEO. Well, I'm a CEO now of my own company of one. But no, I don't believe so. I think you can be a leader, as I tried to say earlier. You can be a leader of a group. You can be a leader of your neighborhood soccer league, for all I know. But the principles are the same. And part of being a good leader is also to know when to be a good follower. And there are many times when you see that there is someone with some leadership skills who has passion and wants to take ownership of a project or a thing, in which case you should be a good partner, a good teammate. So, but to be a good teammate, as I hope was demonstrated earlier, you have to understand what leadership is, and you have to understand how partners and team leaders work together. So I would like to think these skills are useful in being that, but you can be the leader you want to be and it doesn't matter how big the organization or how big the task. If you are really ambitious, however, there is a path, and it is a long and hard one, but I wish you luck in going there.
Great, thank you, Hayes. I'm just waiting to see if anyone else is want to enter a question here, but I'll just wait a few more seconds. Do you have anything else, Hayes, before we probably wrap up here?
No, I need to say thank you very much for an opportunity to speak to you all, and thank you, Adler, for making this a topic. I think it's really
No, my pleasure. Well, I think we're wrapping up here. So, Hayes, on behalf of the University of Miami Alumni Association, thank you so much for sharing your insight on leadership building. It has been exceptional to have you, and also to be such a great supporter and leader for the University of Miami. So we're very grateful for your time, and thank you again.
My great pleasure. Thank you.
Enjoy. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for joining.